It's my honor to introduce Akash Kumar to you all today for today's talk. And Professor Kumar is currently a visiting assistant professor of Italian at Indiana University, Bloomington. And he will begin a new position as assistant professor of Italian studies at UC Berkeley this fall. And so we're all very excited and very happy for him for this wonderful position. I know that Berkeley only stands to gain from this. His research focuses on medieval Italian culture, particularly Dante, through the lens of Mediterranean and global cultural exchange. Recent work on this front includes the essays Walls of Inclusivity, Dante's Divine Comedy and World Literature in the Blackwell Companion to World Literature, and Vernacular Hybridity Beyond Borders, Dante, Amir Khusrau, and Sandow Burke, which is in the Dante Beyond Borders. His work looks at the crossing of poetry, philosophy, and science in medieval Italian literature, but also the interactions between Western and non-Western cultures in popular activities like game playing and storytelling. Dr. Kumar describes what binds his work as being an interest in the process of translation, not just as a technical act of moving from one language into another, but as a way of understanding the crossing of boundaries across culture, class, and gender. Dr. Kumar is also engaged in digital humanities with work on the website Digital Dante, including an essay exploring President Theodore Roosevelt as a reader of Dante from the perspective of American political history. I'll have to look that one up. And a project on teaching and researching the global Middle Ages, the medieval table. Other notable publications include a collaboration with Richard Lansing on the first complete English translation of the poetry of Giacomo da Lentini, which came out from University of Toronto Press in 2018. And he is currently finishing work on his book, Dante's Elements, Translation and Natural Philosophy from Giacomo da Lentini to the Comedy, which explores how the language of Aristotelian science is experimented with by early Italian poets and by Dante. I'll just end by reminding everyone to please mute yourselves when you're not presenting. And if you have any questions for our speaker, to please feel free to put them in the chat, or also the Q&A function is even preferable. And after our talk, we'll have a little roundtable and open Q&A session, which we hope you'll stick around for and contribute to. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Akash Kumar.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Professor Bonanno and to Professor McHugh and to the indefatigable Troy Tower for this wonderful invitation, for all of your organizing efforts. It's my honor to be here, and these are victory laps that I'm on these days, and they couldn't be more fun. So I hope you'll forgive a bit of unbridled enthusiasm, and let me share my screen and get into PowerPoint. Everyone see that all right? Okay. All right, here we go. So again, thank you for that kind introduction, for this wonderful invitation. I, of course, hope that you'll have me back in person in the spring sometime, and not just because I want to see my beloved Red Sox at Fenway, but in person is a fun thing to do, and I hope we can get back to it as we emerge from these strange times of pandemic soon. A couple of notes up front. Some of this material is from a forthcoming essay in the volume Migrants Shaping Europe, Past and Present. It's edited by Helen Solterer and Vincent Juice, and it's coming out soon with Manchester University Press. I've also benefited a great deal from conversations with colleagues in the Cosmopolitan Collective, the newly formed AAIS caucus on critical race, diasporas, and migrations, and from the recent symposium of the Dante Society of America that gave me the incredibly joyous experience of meeting and spending some time with the poet Lorna Goodison. That's where I'm going to end, but I'm going to start us off in medieval Sicily to get us to think about Dante and his world a little differently. And then I'll bring us towards my closing to a bit of contemporary reception in the form of the poet Lorna Goodison and the artist Kara Walker. When Abd al-Jabbar ibn Hamdis left Sicily as a young man in 1078, one wonders if he knew that he would never return. Indeed, Sicily figures in his poetry for the rest of his days as a homeland, a paradise taken from him by Norman infidels. His travels across the Mediterranean world, from his native Noto in southeastern Sicily to Al-Mahdiya in present-day Tunisia, to Seville and back to northern Africa again, trace a telling pattern of interconnectedness as well as the difficulties of making one's way through the regional political turmoil of the 11th and 12th centuries. It's by no means difficult to forge a connection across linguistic, cultural, and religious boundaries between Ibn Hamdis and the poet of the Commedia. These were individuals forced from their homes who sought recourse in poetry, both as an expression of nostalgia and as a means to express their political vitriol in their hopes of changing their world. And the stakes of making this connection, far from being oriented to the long history of scholarship on Dante and Islam that sought to argue for or against the influence of the Islamic visionary tradition upon the writing of the Divine Comedy, instead rest on nuancing our view of the late Middle Ages in Italy in order to privilege the experience of migration and cultural alterity as lying at the heart of vernacular literary production. The Diwan, or anthology of Ibn Hamdis, is vast, amounting to some 370 poetic compositions that range widely in genre. And it has not lacked for critical intervention and commentary from the 19th century historian Michele Amari to modern scholars oriented to both its Sicilian character and its context in the wider span of neoclassical Arabic poetry. But there remains a great deal of work to be done in integrating the poetry of Ibn Hamdis more fully into the tradition, both scholarly and pedagogical, of medieval Italian culture. There are qasidas, or odes, that directly evoke the memory of Sicily, which have become known as the Siciliat, but they are by no means uniform in their evocation of the land. Sometimes they're in the vein of a lament for the lost homeland, a celebration of its beauty and the flowering of Arab culture before the Norman conquest. Other times, they're a bitter indictment of the Norman conquerors of the land, and even of those Muslims who did not leave and perhaps did not resist enough for this particular poet's liking. And let me make sure I can advance my slides. Sorry, there we go. In a tender ode that celebrates the time of youth from the perspective of a more sober old age, the poet regales his audience with descriptions of beautiful young men and women, free-flowing wine, and the sensory delights of spices, jewels, and music. Only in the last lines does he finally reveal that he is not only beyond the halcyon days of youth, but that he has been thrust out of his beloved homeland of Sicilia. And I'll read these two lines in Arabic and then read you the Italian translation. ذكرت سيكيليا والآس يهيج للنفس تذكرها. Sicilia mia, disperato dolore si rinnova per te nella memoria. An English translation, I remember Sicily and pain is kindled in my soul at the memory of her. So I'm doing that sort of reading, the Arabic along with an Italian poetic translation and a more literal English translation. And I'm trying to do that in order to adequately represent the multilingual nature of the sort of criticism that I'm trying to engage in. And I want such an act to nuance our historical perspective accordingly. In order to emphasize a more recent form of reception, both scholarly and artistic, I'm citing in the Italian text from the version of this ode that's present in Francesca Maria Corrao's Poeti Arabi di Sicilia. And that's an anthology that she first assembled in 1987, published with the prestigious Italian press Mondadori. She provided at the time a number of well-known Italian poets with her own translations of selected medieval Arabic poetry of Sicily by various poets and asked them to make their own poetic versions of them. The result is a really important one, a way of emphasizing the historical presence of a different language and culture and inscribing it into the canon of Italian letters by means of employing well-known contemporary poets and artistic figures. This particular ode, for example, was poetically translated by Toti Scialoia, a poet of some note, but also a very well-known Roman painter and an established presence at the Academy of Fine Arts in Rome. So we might think in this regard of a migration of poetry, inflected by translation, yet transforming the notion of Italian identity. Such attention to the multilingual strands of the Italian poetic tradition resonates with Valerio Magrelli's 2015 anthology, Millennium Poetry, Viaggio Sentimentale nella Poesia Italiana, in which the scholar and poet gathers the poetry that is most dear to him from across the centuries. After beginning with the anonymous 9th century composition known as the Indovinello Veronese, Magrelli inserts this very same poem by Ibn Hamdis in the Scialoia translation that he borrows from Corrao's anthology. His justification underscores both the poet's liminal status as well as the importance of including him in such an anthology. And he writes, ebbene sia pure nella consapevolezza di compiere un arbitrio, ritengo che la decisione sia giustificata dal fatto che I versi di Ibn Hamdis, oltre ad essere stati vergati in una parte di ciò che oggi chiamiamo Italia, proprio della sua perdita si parlano. So you have the English translation of that quote on the slide. Magrelli makes an important distinction between what was and what is. That which oggi chiamiamo Italia was by no means a unified and uniform political entity at the time of this poetic composition. He might overreach a little bit in speaking of all of this poet's verses as having been written in the part of present-day Italy that is the island of Sicily. Some of them were probably a product of his youth, which were placed in Sicily, and he was in Sicily when he wrote them. Others were certainly written in other places across the Mediterranean. What Magrelli does rightly, I think, is shift the focus to the status of Sicily as an island containing many Mediterranean identities that do not neatly fit into the narrative of one Italy. And Magrelli is keenly interested in this sort of complicating of national identity. He makes this very clear in his introduction to this anthology. Draws upon the work of scholar Furio Brugnolo on foreign writers who have written in Italian through the centuries, and on his own experience, Magrelli's own experience, as an editor of a multilingual series of books, Scrittori tradotti da scrittori, writers translated by writers. And one of his aims is to transform the moniker Poeti Italiani into something more capacious and, quote, dare spazio alla poliglossia ed al multiculturalismo, give space to multilingualism and multiculturalism. So this leads him to include not only Ibn Hamdis, but to also anthologize Poliziano's Greek verse, the English poet Milton writing in Italian, and the like. In an especially significant move, Magrelli also chooses to include a passage from Dante's Commedia, not in Italian, but in Occitan. He draws from Purgatorio 26, when the Occitan poet Arnaut Daniel closes the canto by speaking in his own poetic language, and thus continues in Dante's radical vernacular experiments of combining languages and cultures. Before moving to Dante, I'd like to return to Ibn Hamdis and to the nature of his poetic engagement with the homeland that he left behind. There's perhaps a risk of emphasizing only the softer side of his nostalgia, one that feeds into the romantic and overly abstracted figure of the poet in exile. The scholar William Granata has focused attention on the later panegyrics and elegies of the corpus of Ibn Hamdis in order to consider what he calls his poetics of jihad, which he reads not as a theologically reductive stance of Islam against the world, but rather as a means of motivating his audience to retake his homeland. And here's a quote from Granata. Ibn Hamdis's jihad was not universal or eternal, absolute or theological. It was a custom-made poetics to fit the particular history and geography of Sicily as extended metaphor for all that was transcendent to Islamic history and Arabic literature, end quote. And this perspective is a salutary one. It prevents us from falling prey to the enervating charm of poetic nostalgia. Granada posits that the poet's move from Seville to Ifriqiya around 1091, which coincided with the completion, finally, of the Norman conquest of Sicily, and that completion of the conquest finally included the city of Noto, Ibn Hamdis's own native city. And what that means is that when he moved to Ifriqiya in this period, he was in direct proximity with thousands of Muslim Sicilian refugees, and thus his poetry turned his poetry into a much more explicitly political direction. But we might also think about those that remained in Norman Sicily, indeed, even those that were drawn to the court of Roger II. Abu Abdallah Muhammad al-Idrisi was a cartographer who was born in Ceuta in around 1100, and he's one such individual. His travels in Spain and Northern Africa mirror those of Ibn Hamdis, though he also journeyed to England and France and Asia Minor. But far from feeling unwelcome or excluded from Palermo, he accepted the invitation of Roger II around 1138 to come to his court. His crowning achievement in collaboration with other scholars of the court was a geographical compendium and world map that came to be known as the Tabula Rogeriana, or the Book of Roger. It's marked by an elaborate introduction that lavishes praise on the Norman ruler, going so far as to call him one, quote, who crafts so many positions of power and erects summits of high-mindedness that reach the stars, end quote. I'm going to return to the issue of the title of al-Idrisi's work in a moment, but it's worth highlighting the contrast between Ibn Hamdis and al-Idrisi. One feels he must leave, never to return, and the other is invited and flourishes. One rails against the occupiers, the other lauds his patron as an exemplary ruler and intellectual. And so the poet might represent cultures in opposition, and the cartographer might celebrate the multicultural production of knowledge. Ibn Hamdis longs for the Sicilia that was, al-Idrisi praises Roger for the Sicily that is. The truth, whatever that might be, is undoubtedly somewhere in between. For Ibn Hamdis, those who stayed and did not resist were traitors, but collaboration has its benefits and might be said to feature more strongly in Roger II's court than in the subsequent Hohenstaufen rule of Frederick II. Much as we might point out certain multicultural aspects of the Federation court and uphold his epithet stupor mundi, wonder of the world, to a degree, we must also see and acknowledge the expulsion of Muslims from the island of Sicily to the Pugliese town of Lucera from 1224 to 1239. And Frederick is an interesting and important 13th century monarch, someone who Dante himself looks to and celebrates for his promotion, his cultural promotion of poetry and the arts, but also one who is not without his problematic aspects. So here you're seeing the map of al-Idrisi in a later copy, later manuscript copy. We don't have any of the originals left. This is from a manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. But one of the benefits of this map is that it takes us out of a focus on prominent individuals with whom it remains possible to make abstract and ambiguous the ideas of exile, migration, and cultural belonging, and instead asks us to move our attention outward to a connected world in a form that might be unfamiliar to our eyes. So this map, as I said, is the oldest surviving example, but even this dates to circa 1300. So there's a substantial remove from the composition of the original work of somewhere around 1154. But there's reference in the introduction to the work that al-Idrisi wrote to a map that was actually inscribed in silver, but it hasn't survived. Whatever its original status might have been, it's very clear that the work serves a very important role in complicating narratives of the backward nature of medieval cartography. And that's something I can elaborate on if you'd like in Q&A. But the map itself is, to Western eyes, a map turned upside down. South is up, and the Mediterranean connectivity is privileged, and we must adjust our perspective accordingly. This isn't atypical in the Islamic cartographic tradition that informs al-Idrisi's work, but nonetheless, it serves to defamiliarize and recontextualize the shape and orientation of the world. One thing that a scholar of Islamic cartography points out, Ahmed, this is that there's evidence that al-Idrisi used a combination of Islamic and Western sources in his work, certainly for the various descriptions of regions that rely on the observations of travelers, but even to the point of using different sets of measures, one's current in Arabic and others in Sicily in the time. And this is a move that might speak to a kind of multiplicity of audiences, a combination of the local and the global. And thinking about medieval Sicily, such cultural fusion abounds. We might think about the Arab-Norman architecture of the period, from the pleasure palaces of Palermo, such as the Ziza, to the Palatine Chapel in the Norman Palace that demonstrates Norman, Byzantine, and Arab influence. I want to get back to the title that al-Idrisi gave to his geographical work. It stands out with regard to pointing out the difficulty, the violence, the audacity of travel. So the title in Arabic is Nuzhat al-Mushtaq fi ikhtiraq al-afaq, an entertainment for those who desire to cross the horizon. But that word for crossing, ikhtiraq, might be rendered a little bit more viscerally and violently as a breaking. It's a telling combination of elements that we have in this title, therefore: pleasure, desire, and travel as a violent crossing of boundaries. And such ambiguity resonates with the cross-cultural experience of migration and exile that I want to carry over to a reading of Dante. So in reading the trauma and difficulty of exile in Dante's poetry, I'm doing the exact opposite of something new. That has been a commonplace for centuries and is apparent even in the most superficial reading of the Commedia. But therein perhaps lies the problem. As Edward Said tellingly observed, quote, "Exile is strangely compelling to think about, but terrible to experience," end quote. There's a disconnect between the abstract and the experience of trauma. And as much as we might romanticize the poet or writer in exile, we do an injustice to the reality of their suffering. In that well-known essay, Reflections on Exile, Said goes on to ask a pointed question, and here's the quote that you have on the slide. Is it not true that the views of exile in literature and moreover in religion obscure what is truly horrendous, that exile is irremediably secular and unbearably historical, that it is produced by human beings for other human beings, and that, like death, but without death's ultimate mercy, it has torn millions of people from the nourishment of tradition, family, geography, end quote. It's certainly no coincidence that the cover of the volume in which this essay was collected, Reflections on Exile and Other Essays, is adorned with Domenico Peterlin's 1865 painting, Dante in Exile. And indeed, Dante comes up later in this essay as an emblem of just how unpleasant and vindictive exiles can be. Here's a little aside for you. Quote, "Who but an exile like Dante banished from Florence would use eternity as a place for settling old scores," end quote. But Said's observation of the confluence of views on exile in literature and religion is a telling one. In both cases, there is a distancing to either privilege the art that is produced or the afterlife that might be obtained. In this regard, I wonder if it might be preferable to shift to the term migration. What might it mean to term Dante not as a poet in exile, but as a migrant poet or as a poet of migration? For that matter, how might our attention to the cross-cultural affinities forged in the Commedia with regard to the suffering and value of others, those countless individuals torn, quote, from the nourishment of tradition, family, geography, end quote, in Said's words, be encouraged by such a shift to migrant poet or poet of migration? In 1929, Erich Auerbach came out with his first academic book, Dante, Poet of the Secular World. It wasn't until 1961 that work was translated into English. But that book set the stage for Auerbach's magisterial mimesis. And it does so by holding, seemingly against the grain of reading Dante as a wholly religious poet, that Dante was a great realist author. In summing up the poem, Auerbach writes, quote, "Thus in truth the comedy is a picture of earthly life. The human world in all its breadth and depth is gathered into the structure of the hereafter, and there it stands, complete, unfalsified, yet encompassed in an eternal order. The confusion of earthly affairs is not concealed or attenuated or immaterialized, but preserved in full evidence and grounded in a plan which embraces it and raises it above all contingency," end quote. This emphasis on the real, on the stuff of history, means encouraging a reading of the poem that is not limited to theology alone. By that same token, as Auerbach calls Dante poet of the secular world, I in turn like to call him poet of the decolonized world. In this, I draw on the approach of Theodolinda Barolini, who seeks to de-theologize Dante in the interest of reading the poem narratologically. In her groundbreaking study of the poem, The Undivine Comedy, published in 1992, Barolini writes, quote, "De-theologizing is a way of reading that attempts to break out of the hermeneutic guidelines that Dante has structured into his poem. Hermeneutic guidelines that result in theologized readings whose outcome has been overdetermined by the author. De-theologizing, in other words, signifies releasing our reading of the Commedia from the author's grip, finding a way out of Dante's hall of mirrors," end quote. In similar fashion, I hold that decolonizing Dante means releasing our reading from the thrall of nationalism that holds the poet of the Commedia to be the father of nation, language, and culture. As my colleague Saskia Zolkowski pointed out to me recently, perhaps the most clear example of this kind of implication of Dante and nationalism and the dark side of it is that a quote from the Commedia appeared on the cover of every single issue of the fascist magazine La Difesa della Razza, the defense of the race. So decolonizing Dante means opening a reading of the poem to global and cross-cultural currents. We might consider affinities with world authors, not in the vein of source study, but with an expanded approach to the era in which Dante lived. Though a couple of centuries removed, Ibn Hamdi's functions marvelously in this respect. So too might the almost contemporary Indian poet Amir Khusro, whom I've been reading of late in concert with Dante. We might interrogate more fully the presence of the medieval Mediterranean in hybrid language, reference to trade routes and peoples across the globe, and consider tensions between local rootedness and the cultivation of an unmoored global self throughout Dante's corpus. Such a global term is one that Auerbach himself anticipated. In his 1952 essay, Philologie and Weltliteratur, the German scholar turns to the medieval in his stirring conclusion that promotes a philology that is not bound by nation alone. He writes, quote, "In any event, our philological home is the earth. It can no longer be the nation," end quote. He goes on to assert that this is a return, quote, "in admittedly altered circumstances, to the knowledge that pre-national medieval culture already possessed, the knowledge that the spirit, Geist, is not national," end quote. After naming medieval names that would support such separation on ideological grounds such as spiritual poverty and holding the material world to be alien, Auerbach then cites from Hugh of St. Victor's Didaskalion the compelling lines, quote, "Delicatus ille est ad hoc cui patria dulcis est, fortis autem cui omne solum patria est, perfectus vero cui mundus totus exilium est." So he for whom the homeland is sweet is delicate, he for whom every soil is homeland is stronger, but he for whom the whole world is exile is perfect. Within this spiritual tradition that Hugh of St. Victor is writing in, the ideal of exile and alienation is promoted with the perspective of the transitory nature of earthly things. Auerbach, however, has a very different purpose. With the final lines of his essay, he turns the citation instead to the dismantling of wholly nationalist philology in favor of a more global embrace. And this is another quote from Auerbach, and then I'll get to the Said quote that you've got on the slide in front of you. Quote, "Hugo intended these lines for one whose aim is to free himself from a love of the world. But it is a good way also for one who wishes to earn a proper love of the world," end quote. So it's a move that Auerbach makes that implicates the link between the nationalist and the theological. It also reveals how these impulses might be subverted to more grounded and cosmopolitan purposes. It's no coincidence, certainly, that Said would use the very same lines from Hugh of St. Victor in his essay on exile some decades later. In fact, what you just heard of Auerbach's essay is from the Edward and Myre Said translation that was published in the 1969 issue of the journal Centennial Review. So Said acknowledges Auerbach as his source of the citation, and he writes the quote that you see on the slide before you, which I'm not going to read in its entirety, but really kind of thinking about what he's doing in the end part of this passage, thinking about how important it is for the historian to embrace this attitude, and only then can one begin to grasp human experience and its written records in their diversity and particularity. Otherwise, he or she will remain more committed more to the exclusions and reactions of prejudice than to the freedom that accompanies knowledge. So Said elaborates on what Auerbach alluded to, that adopting this globally nuanced perspective is vital for us as scholars to be able to truly and fully read that which we study. With all that in mind, I'm turning now to a reading of Morocco across Inferno 26, which recounts the last voyage of Ulysses, and Purgatorio 4, a canto of difficult climbing, a playful yet bittersweet reunion with an old friend, and astronomical reckoning. These two moments of the poem are the only times that the word Morocco comes up. Both these canti also celebrate and temper desire as a quintessential Dantean theme. From Ulysses' folle volo, mad flight across the sea, to Dante character's arduous flight up the mountain of purgatory, ma qui convien que l'homme voli, here a man must fly, there's a Mediterranean bond that stretches across cultures and centuries to link these journeys that endeavor to go beyond prescribed limits. From the very first moment of Ulysses' recounting of his final voyage, one that goes beyond the limits of the epic tradition before Dante. We have a sense of Mediterranean history pulsing in the names and places evoked. The voice that comes forth from the flame lays out the voyage home that will not last, saying, quote, "Quando mi dipartì da Circe che sottrasse me più d'un anno là preso a Gaeta prima che si Enea la nomasse." In the intersecting epic voyages of Ulysses and Aeneas, we see an awareness of names and the cultural weight they carry. That place where Ulysses was kept existed before Aeneas named it after his nursemaid, as told by Virgil's Aeneid. And so indeed, we have an awareness of the cultural mixing poetically narrated by these narratives as Greek gives way to Trojan and then to Roman. And when Ulysses lays out the geographical parameters of his final voyage beyond the western limit of the world, we find a way of connecting across the multiple shores of the Mediterranean. He recounts, "L'un lito e l'altro vidi in fin la Spagna, fin nel Morocco e l'isola di Sardi, e l'altre che quel mar intorno bagna." Ulysses sees one shore and the other, and we find still more specificity in the verses that follow as he recounts that he passed the columns of Hercules and left behind sight of both Seville and Ceuta. These places, Spain and Morocco, Seville and Ceuta, of course take us back to the movements of Ibn Hamdis and Al-Idrisi across their Mediterranean worlds. The scholar Maria Corti some decades ago argued that we might consider this moment of Inferno 26 through the perspective of what she termed interdiscursività, interdiscursivity, a way of reading common tropes across a cultural heritage that's not predicated upon the argument that there's a direct source of transmission to be found. And that's an important distinction to make. Corti claims that this shared prohibition of passing beyond the Straits of Gibraltar points to the, quote, striking relationship between the Christian and Arab worlds at the outset, end quote. Not that the presence of a statue in Morocco warning travelers to go no further in the work of Arab geographers like Al-Idrisi served as a source for Dante, but rather that attention to this shared cultural interest in defining the limits of the world merits attention and calls out the connective tissue of Islamic, Christian, and Greco-Roman thought. So Al-Idrisi's map provides an interesting perspective in this regard. On the western edge, we see some islands that are likely the Canary Islands. Indeed, in his geographical compendium, with that suggestive title implicating the violence of going beyond the limits that is inherent in the experience of travel, we do have a story of travelers going to those islands and making a successful return. Such a focus on islands, and note here in the terzina, the l'isola di Sardi and l'altre che quel mar intorno bagna, right? Other islands of the Mediterranean. So this focusing in on islands, whether within the Mediterranean or outward to the Caribbean, might also bring us to the work of Edouard Glissant. In the grand anthology of poetry that he assembled very close to the end of his life, Glissant includes part of Inferno 26 as somehow important and emblematic of his poetic and philosophical notion of tout monde, the whole world, that urges us to rethink categories of cultural identity. This act of anthologizing is a really interesting one, and you'll note that anthologies are coming up a fair bit in what I'm talking about here. It might be considered, Glissant's act of anthologizing this moment of Dante might be considered alongside Magrelli's act of anthologizing that includes both Ibn Hamdis as an Italian poet and chooses to emphasize Dante's linguistic experimentalism instead of his Tuscan verse. So that's Inferno 26. And now the second and final mention of Morocco in Dante is in Purgatorio 4, which is a canto that's filled to the brim. There's a difficult mountain climb in which we feel the physical presence of the peak, an erudite conversation on issues of astronomy, time, and celestial positioning, and the playful reunion with an old friend. Though the canto opens with a universalizing simile of human experience, wherein great delight or great pain will cause us to neglect all else in our view, it quickly moves to characterize the arduous ascent up a steep mountain path by grounding it in intensely local experience and topography. I'm not going to read these two terzine that you've got before you, but the image that you're seeing is indeed the hill town of San Leo. And by focusing on the steep paths to get to hill towns, such as San Leo near Rimini or Noli near Savona, Dante seeks to actualize his otherworldly travel experience for a carefully chosen vernacular audience. But even in these two choices, he's ranging geographically from in the north, from eastern Italy to the northwest of the Riviera. From hill towns, he then moves to geological features. Bismantova is a rock formation in the Apennines of Reggio Emilia, due west of Bologna, and Cacume represents a move decidedly south to a peak in the province of Lazio between Rome and Naples. With its clear tie back to Ulysses in the language of flight and desire, those rapid wings and feathers of great desire, the statement by Dante poet that he must fly up the steep mountain path is given local relevance across the length and breadth of the Italian peninsula. In this regard, there's an interesting contrast between the first part of this canto and the great astronomical theme that dominates much of the rest of it, that enforces a planetary perspective in considering the position of the sun and seasons in the southern hemisphere. When Dante, exhausted from such a grueling climb, pauses to look back, he realizes that the sun is not where he expected it to be in the sky. And Virgil explains to him that he must think globally, putting Jerusalem at one antipode and the mountain that they are climbing on the other. In the same way that Ulysses' mad flight through the Mediterranean vacillated between one shore and the other, l'un lito e l'altro, so too does Virgil's explanation rely on a formal equivalency that has the path of the sun pass by Jerusalem to the south and the mountain of Purgatory to the north. As shores relate across the Mediterranean, so do hemispheres across the entirety of the planet. We might look at this alternation between intensely local references to Italian geography and the planetary celestial perspective that emerges in this astronomical, turning page, consideration through the lens of world literature. Neil Lazarus has argued for a, quote, local cosmopolitanism, end quote, that sets upon readers the task of situating themselves in context. Jahan Ramzani asks whether poetry might complicate assumptions about localities and sets the task of reconfiguring before us. And here's a Ramzani quote. It may be time to explore such questions from the perspective of polytemporal, polyspatial poetics and consider a different way of understanding poetry's relation to place, particularly as the transnational turn in the humanities reconfigures our understanding of how localities are enmeshed within the global, end quote. I believe we can read the end of Purgatorio 4 in light of this critical perspective. And indeed that it's vital to apply such reading practices beyond the confines of the modern and post-colonial. On the one hand, this canto has the intensely local and personal flair of a reunion with Dante's Florentine friend Bellacqua, a maker of musical instruments defined by his endearing laziness. On the other hand, at the very end of the canto, Virgil's reminder that the climb must go on in the form of a time check. It is noon here and night is falling on Morocco. In the reunion with Bellacqua, there is sweetness and playful banter. He calls Dante out for his exhaustion at the climb. Dante calls him out for his laziness. And Bellacqua hits the nail on the head in jabbing at Dante's insatiable curiosity to know how things work. Bellacqua's was a young death, and this reunion, like those with so many other friends in Purgatorio, such as Casella in Purgatorio 2 and Forese Donati in Purgatorio 23, is a way for Dante to go home to the Florence that he has lost through exile. The way that such purgatorial reunions are received and adapted stretches out to modern contemporary literature as well. And I'll point to an anthology that was edited by the writer Ijaba Shego for sort of a young adult readership called Anche Superman era rifugiato. Superman 2 was a refugee. And in that anthology, the writer Paolo Di Paolo writes a story that is modeled on an encounter between individuals in Dante's Purgatory. And that kind of contemporary reception works only to enhance our reading of Dante as migrant and refugee. So the shift to a planetary perspective at the end of the canto is a really telling one. It's a return to the language of Ulysses' travel, and it's our second and final mention of Morocco in the Divine Comedy. And these verses I will read. E già il poeta innanzi mi saliva e dicea, vienne ormai, vedi che tocco meridian dal sole e alla riva copre la notte già col pie Marocco. Being on the other side of the world has a curious effect. We have to account for jet lag, calculate time relative to our present position and the home that we've left behind. But that home is not named Florence or any of the Italian toponyms that we've encountered earlier in the canto, Noli or San Leo or something like that. Dante has found a new home in Morocco and the sea that bathes it. So when I gave a distilled version of this talk for the Settimana di Studi Danteschi in Palermo this past fall, I had something of a personal revelation. The Settimana is a wonderful program for high school students that seeks to expose them to other forms of reading Dante that go well beyond the way that he's traditionally taught in Italian high schools. And as I was putting the final touches on my conclusion and deciding to end with the line, in qualche modo Dante è diventato un marocchino, in some way Dante has become a marocchino, I thought about the many times that I had been disparagingly called a marocchino during my stays in Italy and just how powerful a statement it might be that I could make. So such a global readership and response matters in the here and now. For some years now, the Jamaican poet Lorna Goodison has done poetic translations of select canti of the Commedia. In these poems, we find a telling impulse to open the poem out to a wider world that grapples with the legacy of colonialism and a personal embrace of Dante's poetry that infuses it with new forms of migration, world construction, vernacular, and cultural identity. In her poem Brunetto Latini, a rendition of Inferno 15 published in 2004, the double simile at the beginning of the canto that moves from Flemish dikes to the city of Padova is adapted in a most compelling way. I'm not going to read the full 13 lines of the passage that you have before you. The image, by the way, that you're seeing is of a dam in French Guiana. But I do want to read the final few lines. Or some Italian town named Padua along the Brent, where they erect big retaining walls with weep holes to protect tower and yard against deconstruction, snowmelt, earth runnings, carry down, and watershed. It's as if hell's civil engineer got an illegal gully contract to bitch up some similar but lean side walls like that. Padua, in Goodison's rendition, becomes marginal, merely some Italian town named Padua along the Brent, in favor of a reference to British and French Guiana. Italy is decentered, South America is privileged. And yet, there is a deliberate ambiguity in stating that this dam making is present in British and French Guiana. It forces one to consider the arbitrary, capricious nature of colonial divisions of land and people. This in spite of the fact that British Guiana has not existed since 1966. Goodison also takes telling advantage of Dante's ambiguity in writing that the infernal embankments he saw did not measure up to his real-world references to infuse a social perspective that dwells upon the corruption of hell's civil engineer that results in shoddy construction. In her version of Purgatorio 12, published actually just recently in 2021, as part of an anthology, as it turns out, which is, I'll show you the cover here. It's called After Dante, Poets in Purgatory, and it's edited by Nick Havley. So in her version of Purgatorio 12, a simile that implicates the Florentine church of San Miniato al Monte becomes another kind of homecoming as it is transformed into a church above Rock Hall in Jamaica. And indeed, this move takes the bite out of Dante's satirical description of Florence as la ben guidata to infuse a perhaps gentler side to this intimate reference to place. So I'd argue that these moves that Goodison is making respond to Dante's own cosmopolitan moments as the intensely local opens up to new horizons. And these moves must also serve to draw our attention to the possibility of a more worldly Dante present in both global reception and in a global medieval perspective. In her 2013 collection, Ora Cabeza, Goodison published a version of Inferno 1 dedicated to Derek Walcott that transforms the proemial canto in ways both subtle and revolutionary. We feel these changes viscerally as Goodison orients us to her own poetic vernacular, her Jamaican patois, and insists upon a shift in gender that makes the canto into a personal journey for her. This simile of the almost drowned, the first passage that you're seeing on the slide here, is the first moment that explicitly marks that shift in gender. And then we have this stunning moment towards the end of the canto, of the guide who is not quite Virgil, perhaps Derek Walcott, to whom the poet is dedicated, perhaps another poet of the generation prior. The important thing is that this poet guide frames their exclusion from paradise in terms of rebellion against hierarchy, against racism, and transforms heaven into a corrupt political regime in which straw bosses make biased decisions about who's in and who's out. What I'd finally like to leave you with is a look to Kara Walker's 2017 piece, Dante, Free from the Burden of Gender or Race. Made in the wake of Charlottesville and in line with the artist's always pointed and provocative oeuvre that refuses to allow us to gaze comfortably as she grapples with the legacy of slavery, this work asks us to look at Dante with new eyes. As Aledrisi's map shifts our global perspectives and I hope our approach to medieval Italy and its migration patterns, Walker's Dante urges us to transform the poet, tear away at the layers of ossified criticism that have accumulated over the centuries, and free ourselves of the burden of that legacy. Those buzzwords, gender and race, are not to be relegated to the contemporary alone. They open up the commedia, urge us to look at moments both revolutionary and reductive that take on religious, cultural, and social difference. Dante Marocchino, Dante the Jamaican, Dante a Black Body, all of these perspectives ask us to see a connected world, to valorize its migrations across time and space, to continue the act of reading Dante, not as an exile removed from the world, but as a poet entrenched in the work of making migrants of us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akash. That is incredibly rich and broad discussion about the poetry, geography, excuse me, and I was particularly struck by the way it relates to notions of nationalisms that would then later grow in the 19th century. I would have some questions of my own, but I would like to open the floor up, of course, really first to our colleagues and those who are attending, as that is part of our main point here. You're getting many thank yous, of course, in the chat box. If you have any questions for Akash, please feel free to raise your hand or to drop a question into the Q&A, or if Professor McHugh or Troy Tower would like to also ask something, that would be fine. You can unmute yourselves, is that right?
Yeah, thank you. This is really, really wonderful. I was hoping you could maybe just expand a bit more on this notion of the migration of poetry at the very origin of Italian literature. I'm fascinated by this process of sort of translating beyond any sort of creative intervention on behalf of the Sicilians of the troubadour. And then, as you mentioned, when Dante sort of ventriloquizes Arnaud in Provençal, it seems like it kind of closes this circle of a kind of displaced poetic tradition. So I don't know, I was hoping you could just say a bit more, since that field really fascinates me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Troy. And I mean, I think, there's something really precious about the way in which Dante himself looks back to the poets of generation prior. There's something very let's say agenda driven about it as well, where Dante is very much looking to solidify his own position, to create his own space, and he does that far too successfully, right? And I think part of my goal, at least, in looking at the century of poetry before Dante, but also looking at, say, the Occitan and the Siculo-Arabic, right? The Arabic poetry of Sicilian poets, is also a way to just take some of those blinders off, those field blinders that are really pushing a certain poetic genealogy, because Dante has asked us to do so, right? He's done his own sort of staging of various encounters in the comedy. He's done his own sort of look back at the tradition of vernacular eloquence, as he calls it in his incomplete treatise on linguistics, and so he's stacked the deck very much in the way that he's wanted to. So I think part of looking back to Sicily in particular, it's a move that Dante makes himself, right? He does celebrate Frederick and Manfred as monarchs whose passing is really to be lamented, because they really unified a space politically, and they were promoters of culture, right? If you have political unity, you can do things like write poetry yourself and pay other people to write poetry and celebrate that kind of artistic excellence. And there's something wonderful about that, no doubt, but there's also something that and something that Dante wishes for himself and for his own generation. But there's also something a little bit, let's say, lacking in that kind of narrative of the point of origin. And so if we go back to the Federation Court and we think about the multicultural production of knowledge that was present there, and we go back a generation further to the Norman Court of Roger II, and we go back a generation further than that, and we look at the flourishing of Arabic poetry in Sicily and outside of Sicily, we just have a different way of interrogating that point of origin and thinking about a different form of the birth of the vernacular.
Yeah, I wonder if you could kind of map the influences in terms of clearly there are linguistic priorities that Dante's choosing, but there are also tremendous structural references to the Kitab al-Miraj and other texts. So I'd be curious to see if there's a sort of stratification or hierarchy of kind of cultural reference being preferred here, but this is already really fascinating kind of call to arms to not take Dante's agenda at its word, which I really respect. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, it's an agenda that's very dear to my heart, Troy, and that's something that I'm always going to be advocating for in my career. But yeah, I mean, there has been this long tradition of looking at Dante and Islam, right? It's a century long at this point, in really kind of thinking about the possible influence of the Islamic visionary tradition on the writing of the Divine Comedy. Even that kind of radical act of right, that publication of that book, Dante and Muslim eschatology, by Miguel Asín Palacios, was also kind of oriented towards a certain kind of nationalism, right? I mean, it was very, very Spanish, let's say, right? So even in that kind of thinking about these issues of cultural currency and prestige and source study, there are lots of nationalist agendas to be thought about and worked through. And then at the end of the day, it's almost immaterial to me, whether or not such an idea was kind of driven by a certain kind of agenda. We have much more recent work that's been done that shows that, yeah, we do have the presence of a Latin translation of Mirage text that Dante perhaps could have had access to. This was part of a tradition of medieval European visionary literature, and as such merits a certain kind of consideration in that regard. The problem with source study, as far as I'm concerned, is that it gets really, really skewed really, really quickly, right? It must have been right from here, and it's a one-to-one equivalency, and that's just not. It's not how poets work, right? It's not how writers write.
Yeah, no, and of course, there's also the everything defaults to what we know about, and there's plenty of lost sources and lost traditions that again we can't kind of identify so clearly and respect that way.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
I had a question too to ask.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Go for it.
So thanks so much, Akash. That was just so exciting. And part of what I find exciting about it is thinking about how this could translate into the classroom. And actually, I'm going to draw on one of the comments that's been put in the Q&A. This is from one of our Italian students. Monique says, I love your presentation. I am also Jamaican born. I was not expecting a link to be made from Italy to the Middle East, then Jamaica and the Caribbean. And I think that it's really exciting to think about how reframing Dante as a migrant poet or a poet of migration could open him up to like the assets that the like wealth of knowledge and experience that different students bring to the classroom. Like when I teach Dante, I feel like often there is Italian American students, right, feel like this instant ownership of him.
Right.
And so I feel like Monique's reaction is like so exciting to me. And I'm wondering if you could tell a little bit more about what it's been like reframing this Dante in this fashion for your students.
Absolutely. No, and that's exactly, I think, where the true revolution lies, right? I mean, it's all about us trying to forget a little bit of what we've learned and how we've been taught, and actually drawing upon this wonderful new generation of students to create brand new perspectives on the things that we thought we knew. So, you know, when I was down in Florida recently and had the pleasure of meeting Lorna Goodison, one of the things that, you know, I asked her about. So I've been teaching a class on Dante's Inferno and its global legacy, right? And the point of that is a full reading of Inferno, but it's also looking to a wide world of the reception of Dante. And I think, you know, reception studies for me is not where my primary research interests lie, but I do love what reception offers to us.
A slight hiccup in our connection.
What was that?
We have a slight hiccup in our connection. You might want to repeat the last.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Am I back now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I was saying that what reception really gives me as a scholar, as a thinker, is something that is just a renewed and refreshed perspective on what I've been reading for decades at this point. And that really is something special. That's something that happens in the classroom. So when I was talking to Goodison, I had just been teaching her poetry to a wonderful class of undergrads who, you know, kind of upper levels in an Italian seminar, and we had just read her rendition of Inferno 1, and the line that landed most was exactly that kind of adaptation of Virgil's rebellion, right? And that kind of thinking through of what it means to put it out there and say that this poet guide is excluded from paradise because they. Sorry, I'm trying to get the line for myself, which I'm perhaps going to fail to do. Because they rebelled against all forms of hierarchy, against all forms of division of race and class, and I'm missing some of it. But anyways, right? I mean, that's what kind of really jumped off the page to me, but it also jumped off the page to those students that were gathered, and it allowed us to just take Dante and run with him in a totally different direction.
Thank you. You know, I think I will read. There are two questions, one in the chat and one in the Q&A, and one comes from Asia Martin, who happens to be a former speaker at this very forum from last semester. So it's lovely to see a community building around our events. And so she thanks you for your talk, of course, and was wondering, she would love to hear any thoughts you might have about the Walker piece and its relation to the poetry, maybe her own work with visual structures, for example. I actually had a similar question, so I'm glad to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry, I had to cut a fair bit of my Walker reading just for time. I didn't want to just go on, and which I hope I didn't anyways.
And I've also allowed Asia to speak if she likes, maybe if there's some more exchanges there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Asia, I mean, I think one really interesting note of context about that work is that it is paired it was at the exhibition, at the 2017 exhibition, it was paired with another work, and it's a really and so it's that playing on silhouettes, right, on black and on white, or white on black, and that's something that kind of animated that collection of hers. A lot of the other pieces of that collection are much more disturbing, if you will, much more explicit in their representation of racialized violence, of the violence of slavery, and they really hit you. They certainly hit you with a punch if you see them in person. They do so in mediated form too. And I think all throughout, for me at least, that is kind of I don't want to fall into the trap of saying that this is Kara Walker being a Dante. I think that does her a disservice as an artist on her own merits, and doing what she does and what she has done for some time now. But I do think that it allows us to think about Dante a little bit differently, a little bit more polemically, a little bit more oriented towards those kinds of moments of vitriol and bald-faced critique, and exposing those wounds of social and religious difference and conflict in a way that should be traumatizing, should be disturbing, should actually shock us out of our apathy.
Thank you so much, Akash. Thank you.
Sure.
It's great to hear from you, Asia. We have two more comments, I think. We have one in the Q&A, and then there's one person raised their hand. So I'll start with the Q&A. This comes from our professor of French literature, Claudia Esposito, who also thanks you for your lovely talk. And she says she's curious to hear a bit more about how the work that appears in Ijaba Shego's anthology illuminates your reading of Dante, or of the Dante that we thought we knew.
Sure, thank you. So, and this again is something, is a connection that I want to thank my colleague at Duke, Saskia Zolkowski, for. So, and again, we're in this forthcoming volume together, Migrants Shaping Europe, Past and Present. And one, I think this is a really wonderful model for scholarly collaboration, where the editors of this volume paired pre-modern and modern scholars together across various language traditions, and so we dialogued with one another. I mean, we did what we did, but Saskia's work is her essay for this volume is precisely oriented towards Ijaba Shego and that anthology in particular, Anche Superman era rifugiato, which is a fantastic title. Takes me back to my ill-spent youth of reading comic books over and over again. But you know, thinking about how to look at those moments of reception, and that's not the only time that, you know, Shego references Dante in her work. In the particular short story by Paolo Di Paolo, I mean, it's two refugees who are happening to meet one another, and so it's kind of just drawing on that basic fundamental dynamic that we have over and over again in the comedy of what seem to be kind of happenstance encounters, meeting someone who you didn't necessarily expect to see there, or perhaps you did, and thinking about how to just take that kind of narrative model, that poetic model, and just apply it to something that is happening on a very regular basis across all manner of cultural and national boundaries. So again, actualizing this idea of the experience of migration and the experience of migrants, and how much of Dante's poetry, very much informed by his own personal trauma, can be geared towards that kind of lived experience.
We also had a comment from Sharina Figuera. Figueroa raised her hand, and I think I've activated. If you would like to speak, Sharina, and ask your question directly, that's fine.
Sorry, I didn't mean to press the button. I was trying to adjust this. Oh. Sorry, yeah, I didn't mean to raise my hand.
No worries. We'll move on then, but thank you. We've also got questions showing up in the chat, which is obviously a very good sign that your talk has spurred lots of new thinking. Elizabeth McCahill, who teaches history here at UMass Boston, was also asking if Aeneas, speaking of Aeneas, who really was a migrant and one who arguably fell apart after the stress of migration, how does thinking about Dante as a migrant change or refocus thinking about Dante as a reader of Virgil?
Yes, thank you. I love that question. Really kind of thinking about that way of reading the Aeneid as an epic of migration, right? As the loser's epic, and how is it that the losers become winners, and what are the costs of winning in the end, of founding empire in the end? I really like this notion of Aeneas falling apart after the stress of migration, right? That act of killing Turnus at the end of the epic that is so incredibly disturbing, I think is perhaps a way of thinking about how the trauma of migration has taken from Aeneas that very basic notion of pietas, maybe. I mean, it's a way of reading, at least. And on that front, I think it's really fascinating to think about how Dante himself weighs in on this idea of vendetta, of honor killing, of taking revenge, and he actually says, so he stages an encounter where he meets he ignores actually a kinsman named Geri del Bello, and Virgil points Geri out to him, and Dante says, well, Geri's really I'm paraphrasing perhaps terribly, so forgive me, but Geri is really angry with me because his death has gone unavenged. He was killed, and his family has not taken revenge for that killing, and the revenge is a vendetta, is a violence, an honor killing that should be the proper socially coded response to what happened to Geri. And Dante says that I ignored him, and in that I have become more pio, more pious, and that I think is very much a reading that asks us to think about Dante as a migrant who oftentimes will give way to many violent impulses and write impassioned screeds against the powers that be, but sometimes is going to advocate for a complete paradigm shift. And this is one of those times. As a reader of Virgil, he is framing himself as an Aeneas who doesn't fall apart due to the stress of migration, and is going to be able to have the courage to say, I'm not going to continue this cycle of endless violence that is tearing my social fabric apart.
I'm also, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I'm also just thinking about that moment where Virgil leaves. And it does seem like sort of a migrant moment, right? They never properly say goodbye. It's just suddenly Virgil is gone. And there's something, I don't know, thinking about it in this way. No, I brought up that moment.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And absolutely. And that's a relationship that has been forged by this journey that they've had together, right? And it's been one that they've changed during and grown together through all of these various experiences, and then all of a sudden he's there no longer. So absolutely, I think that's one of those other ways of just reframing so much of the most powerful moments of the comedy through the lens of migration.
I don't know if we're just allowed to jump in and converse now, but I just
I think we should at this point. It's fine, and our audience is of course encouraged to ask questions or type questions, and we can. It's nicer, of course, to chat openly. Yes, certainly.
This is great. So first, Liza, I think that was a great question, and I just like always, what I secretly always wish for is that we were all talking about the Aeneid. And then Akash, this this description of their relationship. When I taught Dante in the fall, students like more than once asked like, why is there why are there not more modern adaptations of the comedy, and like why this relationship in particular, why hasn't there like been something made of this? And I feel like thinking about it in this regard, you could see it being reimagined in sort of like a contemporary like cinematic way. So again, just thinking about the way the things this opens up, and maybe I could jump off that into a follow-up question, because in terms of like, I'm really interested in not just like the sort of like freeing Dante from the nationalism, but like sort of like the interdisciplinarity of your work, and that is like being highlighted by Asia's questions too. I know you have I saw that you have this piece on Sando Burke, who did the like sort of like modern translation, hyper modern translation with like illustrations, and I just was wondering if you could say a little bit more about like the way that the visual arts, including maybe comics and things like is part of your work, either in your research or the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really is because of the classroom that the visual arts have come into my work a little bit more, right? I mean, they're just an incredibly compelling way to present what we do. And so I've made it a point to just make it, always make it part of my pedagogy. And that, of course, feeds into to a little bit of research interest. And also just kind of thinking about, the sort of the aspects of digital humanities that have become sort of part of my work because of this long experience of working on digital Dante for almost a decade now. And that means kind of orientation towards the visual and thinking about how the visual, textual, and poetic all intersect and do something. So with regard to that, to that piece on vernacular hybridity, for me, it was kind of looking at sort of representations of India, of Indian things that kind of somehow come up in the medieval Italian tradition of the 13th century and the 14th century, so Dante, and then reading Dante alongside this almost contemporary poet of his, Amir Khusro, not arguing that they are actually connected by way of poetic inspiration or any way in which you can find material connections between them, but rather they lived at the same time. They were doing things that are somehow connected to one another. And I think that's exactly what's so interesting about Burke's adaptation of Dante, where you have Burke who is trying to go global and trying to go more and more global as he goes through the poem, right? So if his Inferno is very kind of rooted still to an American urban landscape, we start seeing from Purgatorio on, other things that are creeping in. So even, you have kind of multicultural stuff, polyglot stuff that's coming through in some of the earlier illustrations, but then you start seeing kind of Tokyo-scapes coming through in Purgatorio, and then you start seeing the reimagining of a purgatorial, a meeting with a purgatorial angel, reimagined as a Hindu temple, and then finally, right? I mean, you get that kind of revolutionary moment at the end of the Virgin Mary, and the encounter with the Virgin Mary almost at the end of the entire poem, reimagined as the Hindu goddess Saraswati, the goddess of music and knowledge. And so, right, those ways in which Burke is just provoking us, asking us to think about what we thought we knew so very differently, so much more globally, and my argument is that he is responding, at least in part, to those radical moments of affinity from Dante himself, right? When Dante in Paradiso 19 talks about the injustice of condemning a man who was born on the banks of the Indus River just because he didn't read about Christ, but he was good in all other ways, it is a way for us to kind of think about what Dante is doing in his own moment and how people across the centuries are responding in kind.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to read that piece.
Let me ask our audience if there are any further questions. Let me maybe ask Akash if he wants to take any further questions.
Oh.
Happy to. Go ahead, Asia.
Okay. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, have you faced any challenges with this kind of reading of Dante and with the kinds of moves that you're making across the globe and, likening the Caribbean, or not likening, but, bringing in the Caribbean and looking at the Mediterranean? How do you overcome, I guess, maybe challenges that you may face, if you faced any in that way? And that's just it really to help me as I do my work. I'm working on I'm looking at Mario Schifano, and I'm looking at his experience at the Cinecittà refugee camps. He's a modern artist. He's known as sort of the quintessential Italian pop artist, and I'm looking at that refugee experience as something that is very important, and looking at his work, and I am weary of, feedback or challenges. And so I'm wondering how have you dealt with those kinds of things if you receive those kinds of questions?
It's not easy, Asia. Sometimes there are challenges. There is a tradition, right? And especially in the case of a poet like Dante, you have a lot of a field that's very set in a certain way of reading and a certain way of reproducing scholarly ideas, and
Yes.
It's hard. It's hard to push in new directions sometimes. That makes it all the more vital. It makes it all the more important, and something that I can say personally that I it took a little bit of time for me to find the courage to do this. I'm glad I did. I think it had to be done, and I think one way in which I've never had really hard challenges put to me saying you're just dead wrong in the way that you're approaching this. But I have had sort of but aren't you falling into the trap of what many people say is the problem of an approach like Mediterranean studies, where you are looking at the forest and not paying attention to the individual trees or something like that, right? Too much of a broad, big picture perspective and not getting right down into the details. So part of my response to a challenge like that is to say, I'm going to do both. I'm always going to insist on showing you empirically oriented evidence. Here's why I'm saying what I'm saying. Here's how I am going to take you through a tradition of one particular trope, one particular model. Here it is, here, and here. Let's talk about, let's say, Goodison and that moment in Inferno 1 where she is translating Virgil's rebellion into a rebellion against all forms of hierarchy, and say that she's not getting this out of nowhere. Let's go back to the context of what Dante is doing with Virgil in that moment, what kind of a Virgil he is presenting us with as an emblem of the problem of exclusion, and then let's go from there, and then let's see how it's a received idea. Let's see how other people are working with this and responding accordingly. So I think the challenges are going to be there. They're always going to come, and that just means you've got to fight. And you've got to continue to make your voice heard, and I can promise you I will be there to support it.
Thank you for your answer. That was one. Thanks, gosh.
Pull the classic there. It looks like there might not be any further questions. In which case, I think perhaps, we're at about 2:30. Akash, thank you for this thought-provoking presentation that clearly has got many people thinking about many different aspects, which shows how particularly rich it is and was. So we look forward to hearing more about this. So it looks like, yes, we are going to draw to a close then. Everyone, if you're here, there's emojis, there's clapping emojis. You can clap with hands. Troy has just posted a link if you'd like to sign up for our mailing list. It's so nice to see people coming back and joining us for our events. So thank you so much, Akash. This was really wonderful. Grazie mille.